Hello and welcome. This is going to be a tier list discussion for October 2023. And as we all know, these are subjective, which means that no one's opinion is actually right on these. But what we have done here is we've come up with a list of rules so we can kind of organize where units go. And hopefully, you kind of see the reasoning behind that. And then maybe we can better understand the meta as a result. So what is the meta? The meta is basically what a lot of people are doing, and to meta game means to go beyond the game and think about what your opponent is doing so that you can answer their units more effectively or answer their playstyle more effectively. So you're thinking about how your opponent's playing, what the decisions they're making outside of the game so that you can make better decisions. And the reason we have this tier list here is I think that there are certain types of metagames that are healthier than others. I would say there are probably two healthy metagame situations. And for this tier list, we have the S tier units that are meta warpers, and we have the D tier units that are just never worth really playing because they suck. And in a healthy meta, I would say there are two configurations. The first is there are a lot of different S tier units. So the game feels really impactful. A lot of units feel very impactful. Like, it's my spirit unit, man. I have to play it. I'm so excited. Oh my God. And you're like super excited to play it. And everything just feels fun and dynamic. And while there's probably a lot of polarizing matchups because everything feels overpowered, it's still very exciting because, like everything feels like it has value. The other type I would say that you would want to see is like very few or no S tier units, and the S tier units that exist are like very weakly S tier, right? Like they're not like super meta defining or meta warping. There's like just barely. They're just barely better than their counterparts, right? And then there are no D tier units. And then you have a healthy spread of like A and B tier units. Most of your units are in the A or the B tier. And then you have a couple units or some units in the C tier. And the reason for that is you want your units to feel kind of balanced in a way where like it always feels like you can come back into the game. And it always feels like there's a chance to come back, because that's what makes the game exciting, is that like I always have a chance, all my actions feel relevant, and it feels like there's counterplay. And that's a big deal, right? Like when you're able to do something to outwit your opponent that feels really good in the game. So these S tier units, they're the OP ones, they're meta warpers. Effectively, they push units out of the meta, they make them not worth running. They are a strong argument for why you should not run this unit in your deck if you're thinking critically about how your opponent is playing. So generally speaking, I think they're generally having a bad effect on the game, unless like there's a lot of different ones of them. The A tier units, they are strong in a lot of different situations. They will usually give you tempo when they are played in the correct circumstance. Like if I make a predator tank and my opponent has a lot of rhinos on the field, it'll just crush their rhinos and give me a large economy lead and control of the game. My opponent will be forced to switch their unit to answer the units. Otherwise, they're just like a solid pick, and they're something you want to be running in pretty much any matchup you're in, just because you're going to need it at some point to overpower your opponent. The B tier units are decent, they're reliable. They're not necessarily tempo winners, they're not necessarily like the strongest unit ever, but they are necessary for your deck to function. Like, they're reliable, they perform some function in your deck that is required, like saving money or doing a little bit of extra damage in a situation that you need it to be in. And then the C tier units, these are like worse than the B tier units. They are overpowered in some circumstances and like terrible in others. For example, Machine Gun Squad is like really broken in some circumstances, but it is like terrible in other circumstances. So it is in the inconsistent bucket. And then you have the D tier, which is you're basically making your deck significantly worse by playing the unit. It's lowering your options and it's lowering your tools to deal with your opponent. And playing the unit will effectively lower your power level on the field, or the game will be over by the time the unit comes online. So these are the units that are typically in the D tier. So starting off here, we have GDI, we have Slingshot, and Razorback. And the reason these are S tier is because they're just meta definers. Razorback is honestly the meta definer of the game right now. It's basically, not everyone's really playing it per se, but if your deck can't answer Razorback, it feels really bad. It feels like you just auto surrender because it's just such a it's such a tempo controlling unit because it can get infinite value by just hovering in and out of combat over these missile squads and other units that are supporting it. And Nod doesn't really have a great answer to Razorback right now, so for that reason, Razorback is the meta-defining unit. And then you have Slingshot, which is really good against Razorback, but it also is really good against pretty much all the other air units in the game, which is pushing a lot of the air units out of the game, particularly on Nod. Nod has almost no viable or good air units, whereas GDI has a couple. And I would say Slingshot is largely responsible for that. It has a meta-warping effect. It's kind of unfortunate. And so now we look at the A tier here, and we see that there is a missile squad as the premier unit. And the reason I say missile squad is an A tier is because it pairs really well with Razorback. You're not wrong making it. It's super versatile. It helps you save bank, so you can save up for these better units as well. And it's just a really good unit. You're probably going to want to put it in your deck. Shockwave is a nice beef wall unit that can help tank shots for your other units. You can run it with Pitbull, great synergy here, running your Pitbull so your Shockwaves. You can run it with Predator, same synergy, or you can run it with Slingshot. It can be a frontliner for your Slingshot so that it tanks the damage and it repels anything that might kill it, like these Grenadiers. Snipers are really good as well. They get insane value, and a great player's hands, like the best player, I would argue that snipers might be S tier, honestly. But in most players' hands, they feel pretty counterable. You can just overwhelm them and make too many units, and they kind of crumble and buckle. They're not able to block as well. And certain maps are kind of just a struggle for snipers to play on. And then also Razorback is just like a natural counter to sniper. So unless they get to the combo of Slingshot, Sniper, and then enough other units to actually keep their snipers blocked, it's not always the best strategy. So I would say that Sniper is like borderline insane, but for only a very few select number of players. And then Dogs are really good at winning the first missile. It seems like an A tier unit just because you keep them healthy and it's very hard to kill them. They're just so tanky, and they're great for blocking for your snipers. So great unit there. Pitbull is a very versatile unit, just great to make against a whole bunch of different units, particularly these air units, and great unit to make. Predator is really good at securing tempo against like Rhino, Buggy. It's arguably one of the best War Factory units right now. It just wins most of the War Factory matchups, minus like Giga and MLRS. And for that reason, I'd say it is a solid A tier unit just because it is kind of a tempo getter. And then finally, we have Orca. Orca is very versatile as well for shutting down the War Factory. It kind of does lose to Pitbull spam, if it has some support overall, but I would say that Orca's power is in its ability to just quickly flip pads and kill units that are really beefy or tanky, like you can use it to snipe Giga, MLRS, or Predator, and even tech units, really. And the ability for it to fly and like go to any part of the map is really good, as well as its ability to harass the Harvester and basically create pressure elsewhere on the map, which forces your opponent to kind of pull their support and their power away from the middle. So that gives you like a route to kind of take control of the map asymmetrically. So it's very powerful for that reason. And then in the B tier here, we have rifles. I think they're just kind of bad in this meta, particularly because GDI tends to run a lot of dogs. So I have them in B tier as a result. Grenadier is really good. I'd say there are a couple matchups that kind of throw it off, which are Slingshot plus Shocks. Generally, you're running like Razorback and Grenadier. Razorback can't really beat the Shocks because the Slingshot's protecting them, and then Grenadier can't really beat the Slingshot because the Shocks are protecting it. So it's kind of a catch-22 where it just doesn't work. And the Grenadier is also kind of bad against Flame Tank, but fortunately that's a little less common. So I'd say that Grenadier overall is decent. It's a pretty decent unit, but it does have a couple vulnerabilities. Rhino is really good. I would say that it would probably be an A tier if not for the fact that Slingshot exists. I think that Slingshot does what Rhino would do otherwise, which is counter Razorback. You can play Rhino. It's not a terrible unit. The other problem with Rhino is that it kind of loses in these tank matchups because you're 20 Tiberium behind. It puts you behind on tempo. If your opponent is running tanks and you're running tanks, they're just going to get their tank online a little bit sooner, and so that gives them the control to it gives them priority of the middle of the map, which makes it harder to kind of fight your way back in. So for that reason, I have Rhino in B tier. It's pretty decent, but has a little bit of a shortcoming. MLRS is really good, but the biggest issue is I'd say we're in kind of an infantry slash air meta with the Razorback. So these are bad answers to MLRS, or the answers that are good against MLRS are ones that kind of shut it down completely. Like McNeil completely shuts down MLRS still. I don't think he's very common, but it's very annoying to face him. I think that people who play Orca kind of shut down, or these air heavy decks kind of shut down MLRS, makes it kind of hard to play it. And Solomon's really good against it. You know, there are just a lot of different answers to MLRS right now that kind of make it hard to play. And then it's also kind of map dependent. It's still very good. It's very good in these War Factory heavy matchups. But, you know, basically, if you like microing the unit a lot, knowing when to move it forward, knowing when to preserve its shots, knowing when to let it fire, this is like a unit that is good, that you might enjoy. But otherwise, you know, it's like this very specific unit that I think is hard for a lot of people to play properly. Mohawk, I think, is doing better simply because there's a lot of Rhino, there's a lot of Buggy in the meta, and it's good into those units. And there seems to be a little bit less Stealth Tank, maybe, you know, like seems like the Stealth Tank, people are playing it, but it just feels like Mohawk does what it needs to do, which is it kind of peels back the units that are bad against it, and it kind of, it's not as bad as it used to be, because Chuggy is a little bit worse as well, right? Like, you kind of are incentivized to run like rifle plus missile with the Mohawk, and since there's less Chuggy presence, you're able to protect your Mohawk a little bit better because those clouds aren't just like going all over the place. So your Mohawk can actually do relevant damage to the Chuggy, acting as an anchor for the rest of your army, and then your other units aren't like scared for their life because the clouds aren't just zoning them off the map. So I think Mohawk's just doing a little bit better in this meta overall. And then Hammerhead's a really good unit. It's just, problem is you generally want to have it alone in the air tower, which means the first one's going to cost 140, which means you're probably not going to be able to play it against a close matchup where you're just spamming units. But I think it does a decent job against Razorback, and I think it does a great job against Banshee. So I would have it in the B tier as a result. Now, moving on to C tier here. Machine Gun Squad is broken at times and then terrible at others. I think it's just not reliable against like Rhino, Buggy, McNeil, Razorback, Snipers in some circumstances, Solomon. You know, it feels terrible to play against it sometimes, but you know, there's just so many like hard answers to it that it is not consistent. I'd say like the top players who play it, they struggle to get above like an 80% win rate with it, which is kind of telling because a lot of the other top players who are playing at the highest level have like a 90+% win rate. So for that reason, I'd say, you know, it's inconsistent. Jump Jet Troopers kind of have a similar inconsistency problem. You know, you're usually trying to flip pads with them. They're not very great in combat. You can use them to do decent damage to like tanks and stuff, but overall, I'd say the meta is just bad for them. You know, you have Rhino, Buggy, a lot of that, which is a natural counter to them, soft counter. And then you have Shocks and Sniper and Razorback, and these units all just hard counter the Jump Jet Trooper. Like, you're never going to be able to jump over these units. So you have to engineer a very specific situation, kind of hard to do. So it's a decent unit, but I'd say it's like, it's kind of strong in a lot of circumstances. It's really annoying to play against, but it's inconsistent. Shatterer is okay, but the big problem with it is you're not really making it proactively. You're making it in response to things, and it performs only really well when it's on defense. So usually speaking, it's not going to be on defense because there's no motivation to make it proactively. So the best use I've seen with it is you make Razorback as your primary anti-infantry, and then you make Shatterer as a backup plan if the Razorback doesn't work. Specifically against the Shock Slingshot combo, you're going to want the Shatterer to kind of come in and clean up. Seems like a niche deck that is kind of propped up, but I don't see a lot of people playing it. So your mileage may vary on that. It's a cool unit, but unfortunate, you know, it just doesn't seem to really cut the mustard. I'd say it's below decent slightly. And then APC here, another slightly below the mustard unit here. Doesn't really cut the mustard, I should say. And the reason is it just comes on a little bit too late. You know, like it should be an answer to Razorback, you'd think, but I'd say stabilizing into APC is kind of hard just because the first one's so expensive, and then the second one is also expensive, and then the third one is also expensive. So, and usually this unit wins by, you know, you have the APC kind of anchoring your army and keeping damage away from your other units, but also you protect your APC and you keep it healthy so that it can do that roll later when the missile is going to fire. So the big problem is reaching that point is kind of hard when it costs 90. So I'd say it's just like slightly inconsistent. Now, the big problem here is that Banshee and Slingshot are meta, so it naturally pushes these two out. Banshee just barely beats Talon. I think it's slightly better because of the Raider. So even if you're not on defense with the Banshee, you can still just trade favorably against Talon. And the big problem here is I think drones are actually better than Talon right now, particularly against Nod, but Slingshot exists. So it's just, invalid. Who cares? The unit's bad. And then Borka is actually better than it was in the past. I think that the bombs dropping faster makes it better. Definitely makes the stealth tank matchup, which used to be stealth tank favored in the past, more skill-based, because if you can bait the stealth tank into moving and the bombs are already dropping on the Borka, you can actually kill the stealth tank. It just takes 3 bombs. So ultimately, that means the Borka has a better chance. Also, it being cheaper makes it better. It's just really hard to play this unit. Even though it got buffed, it's barely a buff because it's so hard to play this unit that it's almost not worth doing. Now, I've seen people get away with like a double Harv weird strat with this, which makes me think that it's kind of like this toxic design space where it's like, if it's good, it's too good. But yeah, I don't know, man. Like it suffers from the same design problem as Inferno, but I'd say it's inconsistent. Sometimes it feels really strong, and then sometimes it feels totally like a nothing burger. So moving on to the D tier, we have Battering Ram and we have MSV. These units actively lower your chance of winning because they lower your effective power on the field. Strongly recommend not playing them because MSV takes up a pop cap, so does Battering Ram, but they have no battlefield presence. They just don't do anything. They don't attack units, and MSV just makes your units faster, which is not really useful if you are needing additional pop cap to attack your opponents and pressure them. So these two units are kind of bad. And then tech is just bad because it takes too long to get it online. Game's already over, usually. But these units are overpowered in general, except Wolverine, in my opinion, and Sandstorm. These two units are probably underpowered for their cost. Just because, the amount of stats they have, what they do is kind of insane. It's just, you can't afford them, so they're not really worth running. And then moving on to Commanders here. Solomon, he's really good. He shuts down all tech, which is, somewhat relevant. And then he also helps break up these slingshot fortress setups where if they're set up and you don't really have an answer, you can just Solomon in a way. And that's pretty nice. It's good to see Solomon in the A tier. I think he's generally been in B or C tier for most patches. He's just kind of expensive and not really worth running. He's always good against tech, but tech is like a lower ladder thing. So obviously, it's nice to see him in the A tier. Strong Arm, solid A tier pick. I think that she's arguably the best commander in some matchups, particularly on some maps. And she's just really consistent. Sometimes you're going to want to run Jackson instead just because certain units are running. But I'd say Strong Arm is a very solid pick for just peppering these model units down and getting a little extra damage in and blocking. Really good. And then Jackson, he is he's the easiest to play commander, I'd say, by a long shot. Strong Arm, you kind of have to know when to drop the turret and specifically where to drop the turret. If you drop it in the wrong place, or if you can't engineer a situation where it's being dropped in a really good spot, which is kind of important as well, kind of forcing your opponent to position awkwardly so the turret is in a good spot, she loses a little bit of value. But with Jackson, even if you mess up the boost, it's not the end of the world. It's just, generally speaking, he pairs a little bit better with certain things. He pairs really well with Predator. It's kind of required. Same with MLRS. And then I think it just has really good synergy with Razorback and Grenadier here. And then also it has decent synergy with Sniper and Shock as well, though I might actually run Strong Arm sometimes with Sniper over Jackson. And then with C tier, we have McNeil and we have Liang. And McNeil here is really good against certain things like MLRS and Giga and MG Squad. And he's trash against everything else. He's absolutely unplayable against everything else, in my opinion. If your commander power is useful 1 in 20 times being used, and that's if you're really astute and you know when to use it and you know exactly how to use it and engineer that situation, that is not good. So, I look at how people use McNeil, and I'd say the biggest issue is he doesn't do anything. He slows their attack speed very, very slightly. And this is kind of a big deal against MLRS because it makes it take longer to set up, makes it take longer to rotate its turret, it makes it take longer to actually fire the missiles, which can add 7 seconds to its first attack, 7 or 8 seconds. But against other units, it barely does anything because you just move out of the trap. Like Predator, you just move out of the trap, you boost around it. So I would say overall, McNeil is like a nothing burger. Like sometimes he's useful, but you were probably winning anyway, and any of these other commanders would have been better. And Liang, his problem is you can get value with him, but I think he's just too restrictive. It feels very painful trying to place him. Some maps, like he can be placed on like 2 tiles or something stupid. So, you know, I don't know. Like Liang, I'm glad he moves again, but I wish it was more. So I wish there was something more about him. You know, like he just doesn't feel quite up there yet. Now, moving on to Nod here. This is going to be a little contentious. I'm saying Banshee's S tier. And stick with me here for a moment because I know that Banshee's stats are not broken. He does not feel broken to face Banshee, right? Like the unit feels fair overall. The big problem is that it pushes these air units out of the meta. I feel like it's not worth making a Phantom, which is saying something, right? Like Phantom, everyone kind of perceives Phantom as being like this broken unit, but like to transition to Phantom, it's 150 for your first one. Meanwhile, with my Banshee, like it's 80 for the first one, and I can make 3 more, and I'm still ahead because I probably killed your Phantom, and I still have 2 left at a minimum, right? Like if that's the matchup, we're not factoring in other units, but I mean, to get to that point, right? Like that is not a good deal. So, and then Banshee just additionally pushes these units out. It makes this unit harder to use. It makes this unit harder to use. I think Banshee is actually having a very significant meta warping impact because pretty much all the Nod players feel incentivized to run Banshee, it feels like. So for that reason, I have it in S tier. I think it's just a meta warper, right? Like it just seems like it's not good for the game to be this versatile. Moving on to A tier, we have lasers. Same reason as GDI. They're just super versatile, help you save bank. Flamers, they're good meat wall units. You can put them with your Scorpions to absorb damage, and you need anti-infantry, really good. I think Chems are a little worse than Flames, but I think they hold their own, and they're a little bit better against snipers, in my opinion, just because they tank better. You know, like I think Flamers take like 9 shots from snipers, whereas Chems take, 4, 5, 6? 6 per model plus times 3, so 18. So you're paying 20 more for 2 times the tankiness. You know, sometimes it'll be less if they're using dogs or whatever. It'll be 15 versus 9. But I mean, that's still good, right? So overall, I'd say Chems are like probably better against snipers, but you know, like they're a little bit worse against Flames, but they're really good against Fanatics. And I think that Flames are still better against Fanatics, but you know, like you're not wrong for playing Chems. I'd say that they're a solid A tier unit, honestly. And they also have the added upside of pairing well with Jade. And I think Jade's in a pretty good spot as well. So wheels, I think, are okay. The big issue is that Razorback's good, and Nod has no good answers to Razorback, so you're kind of incentivized to run Buggy, because Buggy is good against the infantry plus Razorback early game shell of GDI, and wheels are not. If your opponent opens lasers or missiles, your wheels are just going to be in a bad shape. You're probably going to lose the first missile, particularly if they support correctly, because you're just going to be unfavored. Whereas with Buggy, it's not as bad if that happens. The big drawback of Buggy, like I said before, is if you're in a tank matchup, tank v tank, the Buggy player is going to be unfavored if the other player's playing wheels, simply because the tanks come out earlier and the wheels tank more shots than the Buggy does. Buggy takes 3 shots from Scorpion, 2 shots from Predator. The wheels take 4 every time. So that's a pretty big deal. And it's only 10. So for that reason, I think that generally speaking, Buggy is probably better for Nod, just because Nod sucks against Razorback and this is your best shot. But wheels are better in the tank matchup. So we have it in A tier. And then bikes, I think, are actually a really good opening unit for Nod, surprisingly, simply because a lot of people on GDI are playing dogs. And if you can open bikes against you are in a pretty good shape, because they're going to probably want to make another War Factory unit, right? If they're opening dogs, they're probably going to want to be in the War Factory. So that allows you to transition cleanly to your Scorpion and clean up their units. So Scorpion, pretty good unit. I'd say it's slightly unfavored against Predator. It's really a skill matchup. Whoever gets positioning first, and also whoever can bait shots better and area denial better and confound their opponents, like make them bounce off and stuff, is going to be in better shape. but I think Predator is slightly favored simply because it just has better breakpoints. And it's all about who can do the engagement better in the fewest number of times. So Scorpion, you have to do the engagement better 5 times, whereas Predator, you have to do the engagement better 3 times. So for that reason, I think the Predator's favored, but Scorpion is just easier to play. Like Predator's more punishing because like if you miss micro it, it bounces off somewhere and then it takes forever to get moving again. And then, but Scorpion's like faster. But I'd say that Predator is definitely the more favored tank, just slightly. Decent units here. We have militants, same reason as before, just a bad meta for them. But, you know, they still are decent because they perform their role. They save you money. Fanatics, they're bad against pretty much all infantry, surprisingly, even militants and rifles. But they boost other things. So, like, if you can get them online, I think they actually pair pretty decently with Seth. In fact, I would recommend running Fanatics with Seth if you're going to. And then Buggy. These 3 things can give you just enough firepower to kind of pull through. I would say that it's probably overall a B tier strategy, but it's doable. It's a decent strategy. The boost is really why you're running them. You want the boost on your tanks, you want the boost on your buggies, and anything else that you can get with it. And then mutants are a solid pick. Same reason as Grenadier. They are beef walls. They tank a lot of damage. They do decent damage, but you know they're not really dominating anything. People have to willingly drive into them for them to do work. And their natural pair, the Chuggy, was nerfed. Chuggy's still pretty decent, but it's not carrying the mutant as hard as it was. And it was already, I think this combo was already unfavored in tanks anyway, tank plus flamer, because the flamers would basically just punt down the mutants, while the Scorpion would take pot shots at the Chuggy, and the Chuggy wouldn't be able to kill the flamers in time. So overall, I'd say that this is still playable. It's decent against Razorback deck, but the biggest issue is that Chuggy kind of struggles with Grenadier now, and it already struggled with Mutant a bit. So because of that, I'd say it's B tier. Was S tier before, in my opinion. Tick Tank is it's really strong in some matchups, and it's like terrible in others. So it's kind of like it's almost inconsistent, but I'd say that it's actually reliable in that, you know, it does what it's supposed to do against bikes. It does what it's supposed to do against Pitbull. The issue is when you need to move your Tick Tank and your opponent is able to set up on you, where they have like a soaking unit, like a flamer or a missile squad, and then they just duck the tank in and out, which forces you to do that awkward dance micro. And if you retarget the Tick Tank on the tank, it can sometimes make the Tick Tank move, especially if there's like a latency problem. Sometimes the Tick Tank will actually receive the order later, even if you're not targeting the Tick Tank, or you're not targeting the tank anymore anyway, and they moved out of range and it moved back into range. Sometimes it might do it, just phantom do it anyway. It's really weird. I don't really understand why it does it. It's not supposed to, but I'd say that's really rare. Very rarely happens, but sometimes it does. Usually it's doing what it's supposed to, which is it tries to chase if the tank moves out of range. But overall, I'd say Tick Tank is like, it's decent. You know, like it's serviceable. You can use it as a tank. It's just you be prepared to lose against like Scorpions and Predators, unless you are in like a favorable map and you're getting ahead on economy, because once it gets set up, it has like 6,000 health, which just makes it insane for tanks to try and chew through. And then it just kind of struggles against mutants and grins. I think that the biggest issue really is that Tick Tank is absolutely unplayable against like mutants and grins. Just doesn't do anything. So Stealth Tank is really good, but the big problem is it's uneconomical. I'd say that it's not its best answer to Banshee and Razorback right now, just from a standpoint of, you know, like if you're really good at microing it, you can like 2-2, you can 2-tap the Banshee, and then you can 2-tap another Banshee with it, which can win you games. But the biggest issue is it's like it's a high micro requirement, and it's like uneconomical. You have to kill 2 Razorbacks to gain value on your Stealth Tank. You're probably going to lose the Stealth Tank in the process because you have to put it in harm's way against the missile squad, and then you have to land all 4 missiles. So if you miss even 1 missile on your Razorback and you have to do it twice, you're kind of in trouble, whereas before you only had to land 3 missiles. So I'd say that it's unfavored in that matchup, and it's kind of hard to play. So for that reason, I have Stealth Tank in decent tier. And then Inferno, I'd say, is still decent, but the big problem is it can't be offensive as much as it was in the past. It takes longer to reload, which makes it more exposed to harm. You kind of have to retreat it. And then also the movement speed nerf makes it so you can't just offensively like charge it at enemy units while it's reloading and boost it. So It's going to struggle a little bit more against Slingshot, struggling a little bit more against a lot of different units, but it's still a strong unit. Inconsistent unit, so this is just a worse laser, and you have to work really hard, and people will pop cap you playing it. Scarabs are really good at killing like high value units. They're good against noobs, but the big issue is people just trade in their spent lasers and missiles, and they'll trade in their 10 cost units to kill the Scarabs at positive value. And Scarabs can't really hold pads on one model because you can just flip them. So, and you can use Scarabs to kill friendly units. So yeah, you can definitely beat people with Scarabs. I've seen Great Boy do some crazy plays with Scarabs, and it's always fun to watch him play them. But overall, I'd say the unit's inconsistent. Giga Cannon is also inconsistent. It can be broken at times. It's still really good against tanks and More Factory. Still really good against all these units here. The big problem is that you can just run lasers at it, and if you're not good at blocking, the lasers will take it down. And basically, it's just GDI kind of just stomps on this with like McNeil or with Razorback or Solomon or, you know, just what have you. So I think that Giga is kind of in a weird spot where like it's still good, but you know, it's like inconsistent, kind of map dependent as well. And then all these air units, they just suck against Banshee, and they suck against Slingshot. And then most notably here, I'd say that Cat Ship is just a little bit too expensive for what it does. It's never worth building because you're always behind when you make it, which is not where you want to be when you tech switch. You want to be able to answer whatever your opponent makes. So I think this is just objectively a bad unit. And then Shade, same deal. When they increased its cost, I think they just made it worse than Orca, because Orca can answer like pit bulls and bikes, and Shade kind of loses to them because it doesn't full clear. So it doesn't even take control of the pad, doesn't even have the tempo advantage. And then on top of that, it's still losing to Slingshot, which Orca is as well. So it's not even really good at that. So I think it either needs to go to like fastest, or it needs to beat 60, or it needs to be one-shotting the pit bull on the bike for it to be worth running at its current setup. One of those three, it doesn't really matter. And then Phantom is just trash for cost. Basically, it doesn't one-shot Razorback anymore, so you have to engage the Razorback twice. Probably going to take a lot of damage doing it. Then the Razorback's going to be defended probably by a Slingshot, which is going to kill the Phantom for free. And you also have to spend 150 to get to your first Phantom, and it's just not objectively answering anything anymore. So it's just not economically worth it. It's not efficient. And why run Phantom when you can just run Banshee? You just spam 3 Banshees and you're still ahead of the Phantom's cost, right? Like it just makes no sense to ever make Phantom in this meta. And then finally, we have Flame Tank and we have Artillery. I think these are really strong units. This is just overstated. It beats Pit Bulls, it beats Grenadiers, beats Mutants, just invalidates those units entirely. It's just way overstated. And then Artillery, same deal. It's really good at just denying units at 3 range. And the cost is kind of insane too. You know, it's one of the only tech units I feel like that you can actually afford. It's just barely inefficient, I would say, just because some players are really good at tempoing you out of the game, and you got to position it, all these different things. But Artillery does what Inferno doesn't, so you'll see some people basically play these 2 units together. Inferno will take out the heavy units like the Flamers, it'll take out the tanks. The Artillery will pepper like the rifles, the lasers, the bikes, the things that the Inferno is not very effective against, or very efficient against, especially with its reload time. If you hit this combo, it feels kind of broken. So for that reason, we have it in the C tier. And then we have all these units in the D tier just because Widowmaker is absolute trash. It's terrible against Grins. It's terrible against Mutants, especially at cost. If the Tech Lab was cheaper, maybe not so much. It would probably be about equal. And it's bad against air. It's not good. Like, Shade beats Widowmaker easily. Orca beats Widowmaker easily because you barely take any damage going in and going out. And Mohawk beats Widowmaker easily because you just spam Mohawks at it. And even if the Mohawks are forced to tank, like, it just beats it. Like, 2 Mohawks beat a Widowmaker. Centurion's just bad. You know, like all these units are just bad. Rockworm is like, I don't even know what you're supposed to do with Rockworm. It seems like you camp your opponent's Harvester and bully them out of the game, but like, okay, if you could do that, why not just do it with a different unit? Avatar's like a super chuggy, super tank. It's really strong, but yeah. The problem is you can't afford it. It's 350. Game's already over by then. Confessor's probably the most playable of the tech units, honestly, of these. And I think it pairs okay with like Mutant Chuggy, but I mean, it's still weak to certain things like like the tank setups. So looking at the commanders, I'd say they're all very close. Seth is probably really good right now. I'd say he's one of the best. He's just really good at changing up tempo and pincering your opponent and pressuring down their units. Jade is actually really good right now, surprisingly. You know, I had her in B tier. I kind of have her back and forth between B and A tier. I think the biggest issue is, you know, it's like you have to be good at creating those scenarios. And if you're good at creating the scenarios, she can get good value and she can do things that you need to happen. The primary difference between Jade and Kane is that Jade kills entire squads in one hit. Kane does not. So she has like really high tempo potential. If you're good at like making your opponent switch units and knowing how to pressure them so that they're targeting the wrong unit, you can absolutely kill units with Jade, guaranteed pretty much, because it takes more effort to select a new unit than it does to select Jade and target the unit. So overall, I'd say Jade's in a pretty good spot. And Oksana is just like Jackson, is just a solid pick. I'd say she's doing worse now. She's definitely not as good as Jackson, just because the synergy units are kind of struggling a bit. You know, Inferno, Artillery, Chuggy, these are all struggling a bit. And then with Scorpion, you're not necessarily wanting to play that, particularly if you are not good into the Predator matchup. And then Kane, I think Kane is good if you're like afraid of Predator matchup. That's where I'd be running him. And the big issue is that he kind of sucks into the Razorback Grenadier matchup because he doesn't really do anything. Sometimes he can clear like Pitbull spam or slingshots if your opponent is like over pressured with them, or if they're over far with them. But overall, I'd say that he is in the B tier. He's decent, he's playable, but it's not the best meta for him. And some maps haven't been good for him in the previous seasons, like Middle Aces is kind of garbage. So yeah, looking at this meta, I'd say that it's really surprising because the units actually feel like closer to balance parity than ever. But we have 3 units in S tier in my estimation that are warping the meta like really hard. They're just hyper warping the meta. And this is kind of problematic because they just push all these units out. And it's nice to see that a lot of the commanders are closer in power right now. But I'm hoping that at some point we get... I don't like this meta. But overall, you know, I think the game is in pretty good state. Even though the biggest problem with the meta really is that Nod has like one shell deck. They basically play like Buggy, Scorpion, and then insert Infantry plus Banshee. And GDI has a number of decks actually. But typically, generally speaking, I'd say they revolve around Razorback or some combination. If you're playing at the highest level, you're probably going to want to play Razorback. Some people will play like this Sniper, Orca, Pitbull deck. Some people will play like Predator. And some people will play like this weird Jump Jet, Shock, Slingshot, Drone Swarm, Cheese deck. And then some people will play the MG deck. You know, like there's actually a lot of variety on GDI, surprisingly. But the problem is the GDI variety just feels really polarizing. Like, oh my god, this deck is just crushing me. And the Nod variety just doesn't exist. We're kind of in the opposite state of the last patch, except the last patch, it felt like the units felt like a little bit more reasonable in how you can counter them. And this patch, the units feel a little bit harder to counter. So, yeah. Interesting new meta we're in. I hope you're enjoying it, and let us know what you think down below. We'll see you on the flip side. Take it easy. Peace.